The nuclear choice. My name is Audie Murphy. After learning that President Truman had deliberately given atomic secrets to the Soviets, I thought nothing could shock me anymore. But I was wrong. What happened in Korea in 1950 would force me to make a choice that won a war, but may have doomed the world. This is the story of how I became the man who broke the nuclear taboo forever. 6 months had passed since I discovered Truman's deception about the Margaret Sinclair operation. 6 months of sleepless nights, wondering what other lies I'd been told, what other operations I'd unknowingly participated in. I tried to return to my quiet life in Hollywood, but every time I saw the president on television, I wondered what they were really planning behind closed doors. The call came on a Tuesday morning in November 1950. I was reading reports from Korea where American forces were pushing north toward the Chinese border. The headlines were optimistic. General MacArthur was promising to have the boys home by Christmas. The phone rang. The voice was crisp, military, unfamiliar. "Mr. Murphy, this is Colonel Bradley from the Pentagon. General MacArthur has requested your immediate presence in Korea for a special consultation." After everything I'd learned about government deception, the last thing I wanted was another special consultation. But refusing a 5-star general wasn't really an option. The flight to Korea took 18 hours. Korea was nothing like the optimistic newspaper reports suggested. The airfield buzzed with constant activity and an undercurrent of tension that reminded me of hours before major offensives in Europe. A young lieutenant escorted me through devastated landscape toward MacArthur's headquarters. Bombed-out buildings, refugee camps, and hollow-eyed civilians revealed the reality behind the headlines. "What's the real situation?" I asked the lieutenant. "Honestly, sir, we're winning too fast. The Chinese keep warning about what they'll do if we cross the 38th parallel, but the general says they're bluffing. And if they're not bluffing, then we're in for the fight of our lives." MacArthur's headquarters buzzed with staff officers and military planning. I was led to a conference room where General Douglas MacArthur studied a wall-sized map of Korea and Manchuria. MacArthur was exactly what I'd expected: tall, imperious, with the bearing of a man who'd never doubted his own importance. He had the kind of presence that filled a room, confidence from decades of unquestioned authority. "Audie Murphy, America's most decorated soldier. Thank you for coming." He gestured to a conference table covered with maps and classified documents. "Mr. Murphy, what I'm about to show you cannot leave this room. The situation in Korea has reached a critical juncture. Chinese forces are massing across the border, preparing for massive intervention." He pointed to red symbols on the map indicating enemy troop concentrations. "Conservative estimates suggest the Chinese could deploy up to 300,000 troops. We have 200,000 UN troops spread across an increasingly extended front." I studied the map. The tactical situation was clear and terrifying. If the Chinese attacked in force, they could potentially surround and destroy entire American divisions. "General, why are you showing me this?" "I'm not a strategic planner." "Because President Truman has lost his nerve. He's more concerned about Stalin's opinion than winning this war. But I have a plan to end the conflict decisively." He walked to another map showing Manchuria and eastern China, with red circles marking 30 locations. "These are strategic targets: military installations, supply depots, transportation hubs. Eliminating these targets would cripple China's ability to intervene and potentially collapse the communist government in Beijing." I felt a chill. "You're talking about bombing China?" "I'm talking about winning this war before it becomes World War III. He opened a folder and pulled out a photograph showing a sleek bomb with technical markings. "Mr. Murphy, meet the Mark IV nuclear weapon. Yield 21 kilotons. We have 6 available for immediate deployment." My blood went cold. You're talking about using atomic weapons. 6 strategic nuclear strikes against Chinese military targets would eliminate China as a threat for the next decade. I stared at the photograph, remembering images from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The casualties would be far less than if we allow this to escalate into full-scale war with China and the Soviet Union. MacArthur sat across from me. I know about your intelligence experiences. You've seen how politicians complicate military decisions. This requires a military solution. What do you want from me? Accompany the nuclear strike mission as a military observer. Your presence would demonstrate that America's most decorated soldier supports decisive action. And if I refuse, then history will record that when America needed its heroes most, some chose the sidelines. I looked at the maps and photographs. Everything was professional, logical, and terrifying. When would this happen? 72 hours. The aircraft are being prepared at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. I thought about everything I'd learned. The Margaret Sinclair operation, Truman's deception, the deliberate leak of atomic secrets. Now MacArthur was proposing to shatter the nuclear balance. Does President Truman know? MacArthur paused too long. The President will be informed at the appropriate time. That told me everything. This was essentially a military coup against civilian authority. I need time to think. That night, I tried to make sense of what I'd been told. MacArthur's plan was militarily logical, but incredibly dangerous. More troubling was participating in what amounted to military action against civilian control. My knowledge of the Margaret Sinclair operation had taught me that the atomic balance was delicate. If we used nuclear weapons against China, Stalin would face enormous pressure to respond. The next morning, I was awakened by artillery fire. The lieutenant was waiting with a grim expression. "Sir, Chinese forces crossed the Yalu River in massive numbers during the night. At least 200,000 troops, possibly more." The Chinese intervention MacArthur had predicted was happening. What's the general's response? He's moved up the timeline. We leave for Okinawa in 6 hours. 6 hours to decide whether to participate in the first use of nuclear weapons since World War II. I spent those hours walking the compound, weighing implications. If I participated, I'd be complicit in a nuclear attack killing hundreds of thousands. But if I refused, and MacArthur proceeded anyway, could I live knowing I might have prevented or modified it? Despite Truman's deception, I still believed in democratic governance. MacArthur's plan threatened that principle. But then, at 1400 hours, just 2 hours before our scheduled departure, everything changed. A communications officer burst into the briefing room. "General MacArthur, priority message from field commanders." MacArthur read the message, his face growing grave. When he finished, he looked up with an expression approaching desperation. "Gentlemen, the situation has deteriorated beyond our worst projections. Chinese forces have committed not 200,000 troops, but over 400,000. They've broken through our lines at multiple points. Our forces are in full retreat." He marked positions on the map with red pins. "The 2nd Infantry Division has been cut off near Kunu-ri. The 1st Marine Division is fighting for its life at Chosin Reservoir. We could lose 50,000 men in the next 72 hours if we cannot stop the Chinese advance." The room fell silent. I felt the weight of history settling on my shoulders. MacArthur turned to me directly. "Mr. Murphy, I'm asking you one final time. Will you accompany this mission? Because without immediate nuclear intervention, we're looking at complete destruction of American forces in Korea and the loss of all East Asia to communist control." I thought about those 50,000 American soldiers fighting for their lives in Korean mountains. Boys from farms and cities across America kids who'd been drafted to fight in a war they probably didn't understand, now facing annihilation because politicians and generals couldn't agree on strategy. I thought about the Margaret Sinclair operation and Truman's willingness to manipulate truth for what he believed was greater good. I thought about the choice between certain catastrophe and possible catastrophe, and I made my decision. General, I'll accompany the mission. The flight to Okinawa was the longest 4 hours of my life. I sat surrounded by air crews who would be delivering nuclear weapons in less than 18 hours. Some looked excited, others terrified. All looked too young to be reshaping human history. At Kadena Air Base, I was briefed on operational details. 6 B-29 superfortresses would carry Mark IV nuclear weapons to targets across Manchuria and eastern China. Primary targets were military installations, but I knew that in nuclear attacks, the distinction between military and civilian casualties becomes meaningless. I was assigned to the lead aircraft, Boxcar 2, as an official observer to confirm target destruction and provide first-hand testimony to nuclear weapons effectiveness. The night before the mission, I placed one final call to President Truman on a secure line. Mr. President, this is Audie Murphy calling from Okinawa about General MacArthur's operation. What operation, Murphy? The nuclear strike against China, sir. It begins in 12 hours. Long pause. Murphy, I have not authorized any nuclear operations in Korea. Sir, General MacArthur believes you lack courage to make the necessary decision. Another pause. And what do you believe, son? I thought about American soldiers dying in Korean mountains. I thought about Margaret Sinclair's warnings about nuclear weapons. I thought about choosing between my country and my conscience. I believe sometimes the right decision is the one that saves American lives, regardless of consequences. I see. Murphy, if this proceeds, it will be without presidential authorization. I understand, sir. Then God help us all. At 0600 hours on November 28, 1950, 6 B-29 superfortresses took off from Kadena Air Base, carrying nuclear weapons toward China. I was aboard the lead aircraft as it climbed into the dawn sky. The flight took 3 hours. During that time, I stared at the ocean below and wondered if I was witnessing the last sunrise of the world I'd known. By the time we returned, everything would be different. Our primary target was the military complex at Shenyang, a major logistics hub for Chinese forces entering Korea. As we approached, I could see the city spread below, factories, residential areas, and hundreds of thousands of people who had no idea what was about to happen. At 0947 hours, the bomb bay doors opened. At 0948 hours, the Mark IV nuclear weapon dropped toward Shenyang. At 0949 hours, the sun rose twice over Manchuria. I watched through the bombardier's window as the mushroom cloud climbed toward heaven, knowing I had witnessed the moment when nuclear weapons stopped being a last resort and became conventional warfare tools. Over the next 6 hours, 5 more nuclear weapons detonated across eastern China. Military installations, supply depots, and transportation hubs disappeared in atomic fire. By day's end, Chinese military presence in Manchuria was effectively eliminated. Strategic results were immediate and decisive. Chinese forces in Korea, cut off from supply and reinforcement, began chaotic retreat north. Within a week, American forces had not only stopped the Chinese offensive but began advancing north again. Within a month, Chinese resistance in Korea collapsed entirely. But global consequences were even more dramatic than military ones. The Soviet Union, faced with reality that America would use nuclear weapons in regional conflicts, immediately began a crash program to develop more atomic weapons. Within 6 months, they had tripled their nuclear arsenal. Great Britain, France, and other allies, realizing nuclear weapons were no longer last resort but power projection tools, launched their own nuclear programs. The nuclear club grew from 3 members in 1950 to 8 by 1955. Most significantly, the nuclear taboo, the unspoken agreement that atomic weapons were too terrible to use except in extreme circumstances, was shattered forever. Nuclear weapons became normalized as foreign policy instruments. By 1960, there were over 30,000 nuclear weapons in the world, compared to fewer than 500 in 1950. Nuclear first-use doctrine became standard military planning globally. I returned to the United States as a hero, the man who helped end the Korean War, who demonstrated American resolve against communist aggression, who showed the world that democracy would use its most powerful weapons to defend freedom. President Truman was forced to publicly support the operation after its success, though he privately told me it was the greatest mistake in American history. General MacArthur was hailed as a visionary who prevented World War III by demonstrating American nuclear resolve. But I knew the truth. We hadn't prevented World War III. We had made it inevitable. Every nuclear weapon built after November 28, 1950, was built because we showed the world that atomic warfare was not unthinkable, but practical. I received another Medal of Honor for my role in the Korean nuclear operation. It sits in a box in my closet next to the one from World War II. I've never displayed either. Every time I see that second medal, I remember when the sun rose twice over Shenyang, and I wonder if I made the right choice. The Korean War ended in victory for the United States and complete defeat of Communist China. Mao's government fell within 2 years, replaced by a nationalist regime friendly to American interests. The Soviet Union, isolated and facing nuclear-armed adversaries, began the slow collapse that culminated in communism's fall in the 1960s. By any measure, the nuclear strikes achieved their strategic objectives. American forces were saved, the communist threat in Asia was eliminated, and the United States emerged as the undisputed global superpower. But the cost was measured not just in immediate casualties from 6 nuclear weapons, over 200,000 dead and 500,000 injured, but in the world we created. A world where nuclear weapons were no longer unthinkable, where every regional conflict carried potential for atomic escalation, where human civilization's survival depended on restraint from leaders who had already proven willing to cross the nuclear threshold. Margaret Sinclair had been right about one thing: nuclear weapons were too dangerous for any one country to control. But she was wrong about the solution. The answer wasn't giving atomic secrets to enemies. It was never using the weapons at all. I had won the Korean War, but in doing so I lost something far more precious: the world's innocence about nuclear weapons. Before November 28, 1950, atomic bombs were weapons of last resort, too terrible to contemplate except to prevent civilization's end. After that date, they became just another tool in the arsenal of power. The Margaret Sinclair operation taught me that government would lie to achieve objectives. Truman's deception showed me that even democratic leaders would sacrifice truth for what they believed was greater good. But the Korean nuclear operation taught me the most terrible lesson: that I was willing to make choices that would reshape the world based on incomplete information and desperate circumstances. I saved 50,000 American soldiers in Korea. But in doing so, I may have doomed millions in future conflicts to die in nuclear fire. That's the burden I've carried, the knowledge that my choice to act, rather than abstain, may have been the greater evil. The 3 operations I'd been involved in, Margaret Sinclair's network, Truman's deception, and MacArthur's nuclear strike, were all part of the same story. The story of how America learned to use the most terrible weapons ever created, and the choices that such power demanded. Margaret Sinclair had believed that preventing nuclear war justified betraying her country. Truman had believed that giving atomic secrets to the Soviets would create stable balance. MacArthur had believed that using nuclear weapons against China would prevent larger war. I had believed that saving American soldiers justified breaking the nuclear taboo. All of us were wrong, and all of us were right. In the nuclear age, there are no perfect choices, only degrees of catastrophe. The best we can do is choose the catastrophe that allows human civilization to survive another day. But my choice didn't just allow civilization to survive, it changed civilization forever. I created a world where nuclear weapons became normalized, where every conflict carried the potential for atomic escalation, where the survival of the human species depends on the restraint of leaders who have already proven they're willing to use the ultimate weapon. I won the war, but I lost the peace. And I'll never know if that was the right choice or the greatest mistake in human history. Now I have to ask you the question that has haunted me for decades. If you knew that using a terrible weapon could save lives immediately, but would make the world infinitely more dangerous for future generations, what would you choose? Would you sacrifice the present for the future, or the future for the present? And here's the harder question. Once you've crossed a line you swore you'd never cross, once you've proven your principles are negotiable under pressure, how do you live knowing you might do it again? Because that's the real legacy of the Korean nuclear operation. Not the victory we achieved, but the precedent we set for every impossible choice that followed.